For 7 years, I paid my parents' bills without them ever asking me to stop. I want to make sure that sentence lands the way it should, because I know how it sounds from the outside. It sounds like I was a pushover. It sounds like I had no spine. But if you grew up the way I did, the oldest daughter in a family where responsible was just another word for available, you'd understand how it happens. You don't decide to become the family bank. You just keep saying yes, one more time, until one day you look around and realize you've been the only one holding everything together for nearly a decade. My name doesn't matter. What matters is the story. I grew up in Hamilton, Ontario, in one of those semi-detached houses on a street, where everybody's parents knew everybody else's parents, and nobody talked about money except to complain about it. My parents weren't cruel. I want to be clear about that. They were just the kind of people who never really grew out of needing someone to solve things for them. My father had worked at a steel plant for 22 years before his back gave out. My mother managed the household, which mostly meant she kept the calendar and made sure the fridge stayed full. They weren't lazy, exactly. They just had a very firm idea of how the world was supposed to work. Children owe their parents, and that debt never really gets paid off. My younger brother saw it differently. He'd figured out early that if you made yourself just difficult enough, just unreliable enough, people stopped asking you for things. He lived 2 hours away in Kitchener, had 3 kids with his partner, and every family gathering turned into a quiet fundraiser for whatever crisis they were managing that month. Furnace replacement, car registration, the kids' hockey fees. My parents would mention it looking at me sideways and I'd write the check. I had a good job. Software project manager at a mid-sized tech firm downtown, decent salary, no kids, an apartment I actually owned. I think that's what made it so easy for everyone to treat my stability like a resource they were entitled to draw from. I had enough, so I was supposed to share. The first time I stepped in for my parents, it was the property tax bill on their house. My father had missed a payment during a particularly bad stretch with his back, and there were penalty notices starting to stack up on the kitchen counter. I paid it. I told myself it was a one-time thing. It wasn't. Over the next few years it became a rhythm. Hydro bill when the winter was brutal. New hot water heater when the old one finally quit. The dental work my father kept putting off until his jaw was so swollen he could barely eat. The ramp they needed installed at the back door when my mother's hip started giving her trouble. I paid for all of it. I never tracked the exact total, but if I had to guess, we're talking somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000 over 7 years. A number I can say now without flinching, though for a long time I couldn't say it at all. What I told myself through all of it was that this was what family did. That one day when I was old and struggling, they'd be the people who showed up. I genuinely believed that. I don't know exactly when I started to understand that I was wrong. I think it happened slowly, the way these things usually do. Not a single moment of revelation, but a series of small cracks that you keep plastering over until one day the whole wall comes down. The first crack was a phone call with my mother, maybe 3 years in. She was telling me about a vacation she and my father were planning, a river cruise in Europe. I sat there holding my phone, trying to do the mental math. I'd just transferred $800 to cover their car insurance renewal. I asked her gently whether they'd sorted out the insurance situation, and she said yes, thank you, very breezy, and then went straight back to talking about the cruise itinerary. I didn't say anything. I just filed it away somewhere I didn't have to look at it. The second crack happened the following Christmas. My brother announced at dinner that he and his family were planning to renovate their basement. My parents lit up. My father talked about how proud he was, how hard my brother was working to build something for his family. I had recently helped cover 3 months of their grocery bills because my father's disability top-up had been delayed. Nobody mentioned that, nobody connected the two things. I sat across the table and watched them glow at my brother, and I thought, for the first time with real clarity, something is wrong here. The third crack was the worst. I was visiting on a Sunday afternoon in October, helping my mother sort through some boxes in the basement when I found a folder that had slipped behind one of the shelving units. It was old, dusty, clearly hadn't been touched in a while. I almost put it back. But something made me open it. Inside were several documents, legal documents, including what appeared to be a draft of their will. I want to tell you that I felt nothing when I read it. I want to tell you I was calm. I wasn't. My hands went cold. My vision did that thing where the edges go a little blurry and you're not sure if you're about to cry or throw something. Because the will was clear. Everything. The house, the remaining savings, a small RRSP account, everything went to my brother. I was mentioned once in a line that said I had already received adequate support during their lifetime and would therefore not be included in the distribution of the estate. Adequate support. I had paid for their hot water heater, their ramp, their dental work, their car insurance, their groceries, their property taxes, and the document being used to justify cutting me out was framing all of that as support they had given me. I put the folder back, I went upstairs, I helped my mother finish sorting the boxes, I drove home, and for 3 days I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. On the 4th day, I called my cousin Rhonda, who is a paralegal in Mississauga and the only person in my family who I trust completely. I told her everything, she listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Okay. Before you do anything, tell me about the house." I told her what I knew. My parents had bought the house in 1989. There was a mortgage on it which had been refinanced twice over the years. The current balance, as far as I knew, was somewhere around $140,000. Rhonda said, "And who's been paying that mortgage?" I said, "They have. I've just been covering the gaps," she said. "Are you sure?" I wasn't actually. I'd been paying so many different bills over the years that I'd never sat down and looked at the full picture. So I went home and I pulled out every bank statement I had saved going back 7 years. I am, professionally, a very organized person. I had everything. What I found when I laid it all out was that I had in fact been paying the mortgage directly for the last 4 years. Not all of it, not every month, but enough. And consistently enough that the payments had essentially been coming from my account. My parents had been forwarding me the mortgage statements and I'd been covering them without ever really registering that this had become the default arrangement. I called Rhonda back. She said, "You need to talk to a lawyer, today if you can." I made an appointment for the following week with a real estate and estates lawyer named Mr. Sutherland, whose office was on King Street West. He had one of those waiting rooms with very old magazines and a fish tank, and I sat in front of it for 20 minutes trying to breathe normally before he called me in. I told him everything. He took notes. He asked to see the documents I'd brought, the bank statements, the mortgage statements, the deposit records. He looked at them for a long time. Then he leaned back in his chair and said something that I've thought about almost every day since. He said, "You've been making payments on a property you have no legal claim to. That's the problem. But it also might be the solution." He explained that while I had no formal ownership interest in the property, the pattern of payments I had made, substantial, consistent, undisputed, created the basis for a potential unjust enrichment claim. Under Ontario law, if someone confers a benefit on another party without intention to gift it, and the recipient has been enriched at the expense of the giver, there can be grounds for a claim. He wasn't making any promises, but he said the documentation I had was stronger than most people walked in with. I drove home and I sat in my apartment for a very long time. Here's what I did not do. I did not call my parents and scream at them. I did not send my brother a message. I did not post anything on social media. I did not tell anyone except Rhonda what I was thinking about doing. What I did was make a decision. I stopped all payments, every single one, mortgage, insurance, utilities. Anything that had been quietly flowing from my account to theirs. I gave myself 2 weeks to make sure everything had cleared, and then I simply stopped. No announcement, no confrontation, no dramatic final phone call. The first contact came 3 weeks later. My mother texted me on a Thursday afternoon. No greeting, no preamble, just, "The mortgage payment didn't go through this month, can you sort it out?" I stared at that message for a long time. Can you sort it out? Not "what happened" or "are you okay?" or even "there seems to be a problem." Just "can you sort it out?" As if I were a service provider who had dropped the ball on a routine task. I wrote back, "I won't be making any more payments on the house." She called me within 4 minutes. The conversation that followed was one of the hardest of my life, not because I felt guilty, I didn't, not anymore, but because hearing your mother's voice go from confused to angry to cold is a specific kind of pain that doesn't really have a name. She told me I was being selfish. She told me I didn't understand how hard they'd worked to give me a good life. She told me my father's back was still bad, and that I was making everything worse at the worst possible time. I said, "I found the will, Mum. The silence on the other end of the line was very long. She said, "That was private," I said. "I know, I wasn't looking for it," she said. "We have our reasons," I said. "I'm sure you do, but I won't be making any more payments." I hung up, my hands were shaking. I poured myself a glass of water and stood at my kitchen window looking at the parking lot below, and told myself, very firmly, that I had done the right thing. My father called the next day. His tone was different from my mother's, less wounded, more tactical. He said he wanted to talk reasonably. He said they'd been thinking about updating the will anyway, that nothing was final. He said if I kept supporting the family the way I had been, they would make sure I was taken care of. He actually used those words, "make sure you're taken care of." As if keeping me in a will I should never have been excluded from was a reward he was offering me. I said, "I appreciate you calling, Dad. I've made my decision." He got quiet. Then he said, "If you stop helping us, we won't be able to pay the mortgage ourselves." I said, "I know." He said, "Then we'll lose the house." I said, "That would be a very difficult situation." He said, "Is that a threat?" I said, "No. It's just what would happen." I want to tell you that I felt powerful in that moment. I didn't. I felt exhausted and sad and like I was grieving something I hadn't been told was dying. But I also felt, underneath all of that, a very quiet certainty that I had not felt in years. The certainty that I was no longer going to keep paying for something that was costing me everything. 2 weeks after that phone call, my brother texted me. It was a long message, the kind of message that takes a long time to write and sounds like it went through several drafts. He said he understood I was upset. He said he knew things hadn't always been fair. He said he'd talked to my parents, and they were willing to revisit the will if I'd come back to the table. He said the kids were stressed about moving, that the situation was putting strain on everyone, and that family was supposed to stick together. I noticed that at no point in this message did he acknowledge that he had never contributed a single dollar to my parents' expenses. I noticed that he framed my stopping payments as the problem, not the 7 years of payments themselves, not the will, not the fact that I had been financing a lifestyle I was explicitly excluded from benefiting from. I noticed all of this and I did not reply. What I did instead was meet with Mr. Sutherland again. He had done more research. The unjust enrichment angle was viable, he said, but it would be a long process. Litigation potentially contentious, no guaranteed outcome. He had another thought though. He asked me whether I'd ever considered whether the mortgage payments I had been making might constitute, under certain circumstances, an interest in the property. I said, "I thought you said I had no legal claim." He said, "You don't have a registered claim." That's different. He explained a concept called a constructive trust. In Ontario, if someone makes contributions to a property, financial contributions consistent over time, in circumstances where there's a reasonable expectation that those contributions would be recognized, a court may impose a constructive trust on that property. It's not automatic. It requires the right facts and the right argument. But he thought we had enough to apply for an order. I said, "What would that mean practically?" He said, "It means you could potentially assert an interest in the property that would have to be settled before the estate could be distributed. It doesn't mean you'd get the house, but it means your contributions couldn't just be written off as a gift." I said, "How long would this take?" He said, "Filing an application tomorrow. We're probably looking at months before a hearing, longer if they contest. But there's something else you can do in the meantime." He explained that given the mortgage arrears now accumulating, since I'd stopped paying, and my parents clearly couldn't cover it themselves, the lender might initiate power of sale proceedings within a few months. If that happened, there might be an opportunity to purchase the property directly, which would put me in a very different legal position than I was currently in. I didn't fully understand all of it in that meeting. I went home and I researched for 2 weeks straight. I called Rhonda every other day. I read everything I could find about constructive trust claims in Ontario, about power of sale procedures, about what happened to an estate when a property was encumbered by a legal claim at the time of death. What I understood eventually was this. My parents' plan had assumed that I would keep paying indefinitely, and that when they died, the house, owned free and clear with my help, would pass cleanly to my brother. That plan only worked if I kept participating in it. The moment I stopped, the whole structure started to wobble. 4 months after I stopped making payments, the bank sent a notice. Power of sale proceedings had been initiated. I was not named in the notice. I had no registered interest, But Rhonda had a contact at a title search firm and she was keeping me informed. My mother called me when she received the notice. This time there was no strategy in her voice. She sounded frightened and tired, and I felt that. I want to be honest, I felt it. But I also knew that nothing had changed. I told her I was sorry she was going through this. I told her I hoped they'd find a way to manage it. I said it gently and I meant it. And then I said goodnight and I hung up. 6 weeks later, I made an offer on the property through a numbered company I had set up, at a price that reflected the outstanding mortgage balance and the legal costs that had accumulated. The offer was accepted. I became the legal owner of the house my parents lived in. I want to be very clear, I did not do this to be cruel. I did it because the alternative, continuing to finance a situation in which I was legally invisible and emotionally expendable, was something I could no longer justify. I owned the house now, and I was going to do what any landlord would do. I had a lawyer prepare a formal tenancy agreement and deliver it to my parents with proper notice. Under Ontario's Residential Tenancies Act, they had rights as occupants. I was not going to pretend otherwise, and I was not going to do anything that wasn't completely above board. The tenancy agreement set a rent at fair market value for the neighborhood, which came to just under $2,000 a month. My father called me when he received it. He said, "What is this?" I said, "It's a tenancy agreement, you're welcome to stay. I just need you to sign it," he said. "This is our home," I said. "I know it has been. I'm not asking you to leave. I'm asking you to sign a tenancy agreement," he said. "We can't afford $2,000 a month." I said, "I understand there are rent-geared to income programs through the city. Rhonda can help you look into them if you'd like." He said some things after that which I'm not going to repeat here. He was angry, and I think underneath the anger he was scared, and I have enough distance now to hold both of those things at once. But I didn't change my mind. My brother drove up from Kitchener 2 days later. He showed up at my apartment without calling first. I looked at him through the peephole for a moment before I opened the door. He came in and sat down, and for a minute he didn't say anything. Then he said, "I had no idea it had gotten this bad." I said, "Yes, you did." He said, "I mean the money." "I didn't know how much you were putting in," I said. "You knew enough to benefit from it," he said. "That's not fair," I said. "I have 7 years of bank statements that are very precise about what's fair." He was quiet again. Then he said, "What do you want? What would it take for this to end?" I had thought about this question. I had an answer ready. Because I had learned, over the course of this entire experience, that the worst thing you can do in a negotiation is not know what you actually want. I said, "I want the will updated to reflect an equitable distribution. I want a written acknowledgement of the payments I made over the last 7 years. And I want my parents to sign the tenancy agreement," he said. "And if they don't," I said, "then I proceed with the eviction process under the RTA, which I'd rather not do, but I won't hesitate." He looked at me for a long time. I don't know what he was looking for. Maybe he was waiting for me to soften. Maybe he was checking whether I was bluffing. I wasn't. He left without committing to anything. I made tea and sat in my living room and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like I was on the right side of something. It took another 6 weeks. There were 2 more phone calls with my mother, 1 more visit from my brother, a formal letter from a lawyer they had consulted, who apparently told them they had very little ground to stand on. In the end, my parents signed the tenancy agreement. The will was formally updated, with all 3 of us sharing equally, and my brother drafted a letter, clumsy and short, not exactly the acknowledgement I might have hoped for, but signed and dated, confirming that he was aware I had made substantial financial contributions to the family home over a period of 7 years. I kept paying attention to how I felt through all of this, because I thought I was supposed to feel triumphant. I didn't, really. What I felt was something quieter and harder to name. Like putting down a very heavy bag that you've been carrying for so long you'd forgotten it wasn't part of you. I still own the house. My parents live there, they pay rent. We see each other at Christmas and a few times a year in between, and the visits are careful and polite and occasionally, briefly, something closer to warm. My brother and I text sometimes. It's not easy and it's not the same, and I'm not sure it ever will be. But here is what I know. I am the only person in this story who did exactly what they said they would do. For 7 years I showed up, and when I finally stopped showing up, I did that with the same quiet consistency. No drama, no explosion. Just a decision followed through completely. The house is mine now. Not because I wanted the house, because someone had to be honest about what it had always cost, and in the end, that person was me.